Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next presentation in our Your Universe series. My name is Dana Thompson, and I'm the director of the Brown Planetarium at Ball State University, where we have the largest planetarium in Indiana, the largest dome that we can recreate the sky onto. And we are welcoming a special guest today for our Your Universe presentation of the week. We have Dr. Jen Major from Ball State's Department of Biology with us. We also have, as usual, our planetarium show specialist, Rachel Williamson, joining us today to help us out with questions or comments in the chat. So if you have any questions during this presentation, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll try to get them answered, and we can answer them ourselves, or we can get them to Dr. Jen Major to help us answer the questions too. These past 2 weeks, we have been exploring planet Saturn, the ringed planet, or the one with the biggest and brightest rings in our solar system. And this past week, we've been exploring some of Saturn's moons as well. And Saturn has a lot of moons. It has over 80 moons that we can explore. We're going to be talking about 2 of those moons today. One of the moons that's in the E ring of Saturn, which is called Enceladus, which is covered with an icy crust. And beneath that icy shell is a global ocean of liquid water. And so you can see at the bottom here, there's a plume of what's actually water ice particles and other material that's being put out into space. And it actually replenishes the E ring over time. So these constantly spew from this ocean beneath the icy shell, replenishing the E ring. And the Cassini mission has actually found evidence for hydrothermal vents in Enceladus. And just a reminder, hydrothermal vents are like geysers on the ocean floor. They're cracks where water that's heated by a planet or a moon's interior emerges. And hydrothermal vents are places on Earth anyway, where life may have originated. Well, we're also going to explore another moon of Saturn, Saturn's largest moon, Titan. It's larger than our own moon, and it's even larger than the planet Mercury, and it has this intense, thick atmosphere that's incredibly dense and smoggy. It's thicker than our own, and in fact, the surface of it can't be seen through it in visible light, so we have to send technology to see through it. And in April 2024, NASA will launch the Dragonfly mission to explore Titan, and Dragonfly will be the first drone lander ever. And it'll be able to fly over 100 miles through Titan's thick atmosphere. It has a surface pressure 50% higher than Earth's. And it makes Titan truly unique. It's unlike any other place in our solar system. Although there are many differences between Titan and Earth, scientists do believe that it is most comparable to an early Earth, or at least in our solar system. And the instruments on board Dragonfly will help scientists investigate organic chemistry, searching for chemical signatures of past or even present life. So again, our guest, Dr. Jen Major, is going to help us out understand what life could look like outside of our own Earth. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Major for the presentation. Jen, I just unshared my screen, and I'll let you go ahead and share yours.
All right. Hopefully everyone will be able to see my presentation here. So good morning, welcome. I'm so excited that everyone is here. I'm happy to be joining everyone today. And so Dana just told us some really exciting things about 2 of Saturn's moons, Enceladus and Titan. And I'm here to try to frame why what we're finding might be really exciting in terms of searching for life off of our own planet. And so this is actually a field of biology called astrobiology, right? So astrobiologists are interested in answering the question, can we find extraterrestrial life in other parts of our solar system and our universe? And if so, how do we go about detecting that? And so if we want to look for life off planet, it might be helpful to begin understanding what is life, right? Defining what is or isn't a living thing, because it's really hard to look for something if you don't know what you're looking for, right? And so in terms of examples, we really don't have a huge number to work from. All we know about is the life that's here on Earth. And so we can use that as a guide to define what is life. So some of the questions we might ask to help us in our search through the solar system is, what can living things do? What sets them apart from non-life? If we know what they do, could we look for those behaviors in Enceladus or Titan? What are living things made of? Is their composition, is a bacterium or plant or dog made of different things than, say, water, air, or rocks? If we know what it's made of, maybe we can look for those components on Enceladus and Titan. Another thing to consider is some constraints to life. Is there a limit to how big or how small a living thing has to be? Does it have to be complex, or can it be simple? That will help guide us in terms of what we're looking for off planet. And then the last question we might think about is, where can life exist? And that's sort of an environmental question. So I'm pretty picky. I like a beautiful 72 degrees sunny Indiana day, maybe a nice breeze. I'm pretty happy if that's my environment. But a lot of other life on Earth isn't so picky, and it can give us clues to where else in our solar system we might be able to discover life. So let's start with that first question. What can living things do? Well, there are millions of different living organisms on our planet, and they're very different from each other, but they all have 6 sort of key properties or traits that it turns out that they do. All life grows and develops. A puppy becomes a dog, an acorn becomes a towering oak tree. Even bacteria can grow and develop. Living things are constantly changing their behavior and responding to what's happening in the world around them. So maybe you have a dog that gets really afraid anytime there's a thunderstorm. The noise, the bright flashing lights, they can sense the changes in atmospheric pressure. Maybe they run and hide under your bed or your couch because it feels like a nice, safe space for them. They're responding to that outer world. On the flip, most living things also work very hard to maintain their inner world, what the inside of that organism functions like. Take, for instance, your body temperature, right? So most of us know that human body temperature, the ideal is 98.6 degrees. And that when our body temperature rises, say like when you get sick and have a fever, that's not a good thing. And so we've evolved mechanisms to maintain that body temperature, right? So we're getting to be July, it's in the upper 80s, it's going to get into the 90s, it gets really hot. If we didn't work to keep our body temperature at optimum, that could be bad. We do that by sweating. Your dog does it by panting. But all of that is about maintaining our internal happy place. The fourth thing, or the fourth property that all life exhibits, is it uses energy. It obtains energy from somewhere else in the world and uses it to go about doing its life. So think about things you enjoy doing. Maybe going for a walk or run. Maybe you like going to ninja class or playing soccer. Or maybe you play an instrument or you paint or whatever it is. It requires you to expend energy to do that thing. That means you need to obtain energy by eating in order for you to live life and do those things. And that's true of even simple organisms like bacteria. The fifth property that we know life does is to reproduce. Dogs make puppies. Oak trees make acorns. And this has been happening on this planet for millions and millions of years. The sixth property is more occurring on a species level than an individual organism level, but we know that life adapts to changing environments and long-term changing climates. And they do this by evolving to best live in that changed environment. So these are 6 things that we know unify life on Earth. So could we just go to Titan and Enceladus and say, all right, let's look for evidence of reproduction. Let's look for evidence of energy usage. Well, it's kind of complicated because there's millions of different types of life here. And though they do these things, there's many different ways that life reproduces. There's many different ways that life uses energy. Which one do we choose to look for? Looking for all of them would be very time consuming and very complicated. And so often we tend to think about these types of properties of life after we discover it. When we find a new organism, then we can ask the questions, how does it reproduce and how does it use energy? And so this will be really exciting to think about once we find life off planet. So how do we go about detecting it? It might be better to think about that second question. What are living things made of? Do they have different fundamental building blocks compared to, say, inanimate things like my rock and air? So if we back up just a little bit, everything around you is called matter. Anything you can see and hold and touch, that's matter. I'm matter. My plant here is matter. Even this computer that I'm talking to you through is matter. And all matter is made up of some basic building blocks. There's lots of different types of building blocks, and depending how many and which ones you use is the difference between making living matter and non-living matter. So what do I mean by a building block? Let's use my pizza matter there as an example. If I asked you to tell me what are the basic fundamental building blocks of pizza matter, you might go ahead and list the ingredients that you know go into making pizza. You might say, well, it's dough, it's sauce, it's cheese, and then insert your favorite toppings. But these aren't the smallest basic building blocks of pizza. Each one of these ingredients can actually be broken down into even smaller components. Let's pick on pizza dough, for example. I tend to make a lot of pizza in my house. My boys like that. So I know that it's actually made of smaller building blocks: flour, water, and salt. But even these can be broken up into even smaller building blocks. Take water. It's actually made up of hydrogen and oxygen. Salt is made up of sodium and chlorine. These are fundamental building blocks of pizza because hydrogen, oxygen, sodium, and chlorine can't be broken down anymore. They're the smallest pure substance that we know of. And so we call these pure substances, these building blocks that we can't break down, elements. And so there's lots of different elements. And when we start to put them together, we create, oops, wrong way, molecules. So water is really a molecule. It is an element of oxygen attached to two elements of hydrogen, whereas table salt is an element of sodium attracted to an element of chlorine. Okay? So I could go back to every other ingredient in my pizza and drill down to figure out what elements make up that ingredient. And those would be the basic building blocks of my pizza matter. But again, we're talking about how do we detect life on Enceladus and Titan. And so really what we're asking is, are there elements and molecules that are unique to life that we can look for on those moons that we don't see in non-living things? So if we go back to the pictures of non-life that I've been showing you, we just said water is just oxygen and hydrogen. The Earth's crust rocks are a variety of different elements. These are the four most abundant ones that we see: oxygen, silicon, aluminum, and iron. And even our air is a variety of different elements, mainly nitrogen and oxygen, argon, and then some other smaller gases. It turns out that when we look at non-living things, the composition is really diverse. There's tons of different elements that go into making up non-life. And so what we want to know, is there any element that we're not seeing a lot of in non-life that we do see in our living things? It turns out the answer is yes. When you look at life on Earth, it doesn't matter what life you're talking about. Every living thing, 96% of that organism is made up of just four elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And carbon, the one I have in blue there, is the really special one. While carbon can be in other non-living things, it's not there a lot. but it's really abundant in life. And it's because it turns out the structure of carbon is very, very special. So I could represent carbon this way. And hopefully what you notice is there's a series of rings, and on some of those rings, there's some gray dots. What I'd like you to do is focus on the outermost ring, and hopefully you see that there are 4 gray dots there. I'm going to go ahead and highlight them for you. Those 4 gray dots, we technically call them electrons, are what help make carbon special. And so really, you could think of carbon as a Lego brick. So I have a Lego brick here, and on the top of my brick are these little studs. And each stud on my brick allows me to attach to one other brick. And so each of those gray dots, gray electrons on carbon, act like studs on a Lego brick, and they allow carbon to attach to 4 other elements at the same time. Those 4 can be the same exact element, or they can be 4 completely different elements. And that's special because it means we can use carbon to create some of the complex molecules that we really only start to see when we look at living things. So Dana mentioned that one of the things that's been discovered about Titan is it has these vast lakes of ethane and methane. And it turns out ethane and methane are just simple carbon-containing molecules. So my spinning molecule on the top there is a molecule of methane. It is a single carbon atom, which is the teal ball in the center, and it is attached to just 4 other hydrogen atoms. The one on the bottom is ethane. It's just 2 carbon atoms. This time they're in purple, and they're connected together. And then each one of those carbon atoms is then attached to 3 other hydrogens because there were 3 studs left it could use to make connections. Now, these 2 molecules, the discovery of them on Titan is really exciting because they're what we call hydrocarbons, carbon and hydrogen together. And hydrocarbons are the building blocks of every complex molecule we see in life. So the presence of these 2 compounds in the lakes on Titan suggests one of 2 things. Either life is already there and it's creating these 2 molecules as a product of it living its life, or the second option is that these molecules are setting the stage for life to emerge on Titan because these 2 simplistic hydrocarbons can be used to build the molecules of life, right? So I could take these 2 simple hydrocarbons and I could start to make them more complex structures. So maybe instead of only 1 or 2 carbons in the bottom left there, I have a 6 carbon hydrocarbon. Or I can start to have them branch off into different shapes, like my image in the top right. If I take that carbon structure on the bottom with the 6 carbons, if I remove just a couple hydrogens, add some oxygen, and twist it into a circle, I create a very important molecule of life. So this is glucose. You see it all the time. If you go to the grocery store and you pick up a bag of sugar for baking, it is filled with molecules of glucose. And they're created by plants. So most of the sugar we buy at the store comes from a plant called sugarcane, but you can also get it from beets, and really any type of plant can make glucose. And we can get even more complex from there. One of my favorite molecules of life is this one, caffeine. It's the only reason I am a living human being before 9 a.m. in the morning. So those hydrocarbons on Titan are exciting because we can use them to start to build these complex molecules. And it turns out that when we start looking at living things, right, there's millions of living things. That means there's probably millions of different molecules in them. But all of those millions of molecules fall into one of 4 main categories. Molecules of life are nucleic acids. So those are DNA and RNA. Carbohydrates, which is our fancy term for sugars like glucose. Lipids, which are our fancy term for fats. and then proteins, which they're basically the worker bees of life. They're the ones that do everything that allow life to exist. So those simple hydrocarbons like methane and ethane can be used to build these 4 categories of more complex molecules. But even having these molecules alone doesn't necessarily guarantee life. Viruses have lots of these types of molecules, but most scientists you ask would tell you a virus is not alive. And because what really needs to happen for life to exist is these 4 classes of biomolecules need to get arranged together into a very particular structure. And we call that structure a cell. A cell is the smallest working unit of life. Those molecules, nucleic acids, sugars, fats, all that, they can't develop. They can't use energy. They can't reproduce. But a single cell can use energy and it can reproduce. And so to have life, we need to have these complex carbon-based molecules, and we really would like to see them organized into a structure like a cell. Now, there's lots of different types of life on Earth, and the actual structure of the cells in those life can be a little bit different. So the cartoon I'm showing you here is a cartoon of an animal cell, what one of the cells in your body might look like. If I were to show you a cartoon of a plant cell, it would look a little bit different, although the general overall structure would be the same. Same thing with a bacterial cell. The overall structure would be similar, but the details would be a little bit different. So if we summarize what we've talked about so far, our life on Earth is carbon-based, and those carbon-based life forms have complex molecules that get assembled into cells. And one of the reasons we're so excited about Enceladus and Titan being a potential source of extraterrestrial life is that they're showing the potential for these types of carbon-based molecules to be present, which means they're either already harboring life or they're setting the stage for life to emerge in the future. So we kind of know properties about life. We know what it's made of, and so what kind of molecules we should maybe look for off planet. What about those limitations that we talked about? Is there a restriction in how big or small life can be? So I've been showing you this image of a bacteria. So this is the same image here, but what I've done now is I've drawn a blue line around one single bacteria. So that blue circle is highlighting a single bacterial organism. And these are some of the smallest organisms on Earth. This image was taken with a special piece of equipment called a microscope because bacteria are only one cell and they're so small that we can't see them with our eye. And so we use a special tool. How small are they? Well, if I took a safety pin and I opened it up and I looked at the very tip of the pin and I used my microscope to look at that, you would see that it's covered with thousands, maybe millions of bacteria. That's how tiny they are. So that's one end of the spectrum of life on Earth, insanely small. But we could go to the other end. Our largest mammal right now on Earth is the blue whale. Blue whales have lots and lots and lots and lots of cells. Human beings are estimated to have 37 trillion cells in our body. That's a lot. And so, based on what we know about life on Earth, there don't appear to be a lot of size constraints. The only real rule is you have to be one cell. You can be more, but you have to be at least one. And the size of those cells can vary greatly depending on the organism you're looking at. Okay? So again, as long as we have a cell, we're pretty happy. Size of it, how many of them, it's fine, doesn't matter. That again makes looking for life on other planets and moons a little bit more complicated because that's a huge range, right, that we can search for. So maybe there's some other things that can help us narrow it down just a little bit. And that's that question of environments. Where can life exist, right? Are there limitations? Are there certain places where we have to just rule out there's no way life is going to survive there? Well, again, let's use what we've learned about life on this planet as a guide. So this is a cool image from a paper that came out last year about extremophiles. So extremophiles are organisms that live life at the extremes. So phile means to love something. And so these are organisms that love and thrive in about the harshest place you can imagine. And so, as this picture is showing you, whether you think of inside a volcano, inside a chunk of ice, at a nuclear reactor, deep under the earth, it turns out anywhere we've looked, we've been able to discover life. So let's look at some interesting examples. This is Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone Park. And you might think that this has been photoshopped. It's got this beautiful, intense color. Has to be photoshopped, right? Nope. It's bacteria that are creating each of those colors. And each color, the blue at the center, the yellow around it, and then that sort of reddish orange brown, are made by different species of bacteria that have evolved to survive at the different temperatures in this hot spring. So the center of the spring, where it's blue, is about 189 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty hot. The bacteria that have evolved there thrive under those heat conditions. They're okay with the fact that there's very little oxygen in the water at that temperature, and they've developed other means of using energy and surviving. The yellow ring, the temperature drops to about only 149 degrees Fahrenheit. And as you move out to that reddish orange area, it becomes just a balmy 131. But again, each different microclimate has evolved a bacterium that survives in that superheated temperature. But now Enceladus and Titan, based on Dana's description, they're not super hot. They're cold, right? Enceladus has this entire ice covering its lakes. And Dana can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think surface temperatures of Titan are estimated to be like negative 292 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're not going to be like a hot spring. Got you covered. Meet H. methanincola, or the ice worm. So this image is again taken with a microscope because I think it looks really cool to see them up close. But they live in ice, like in the ice. So you could actually see them with your naked eye. They would look like really tiny little black squiggly things moving around. But they have evolved to only survive inside of ice. If you were to remove them from ice and let them come up to like a normal room temperature, they would actually melt. Their cellular structures, their molecules would start to break down and they would melt, just like Olaf when he gets too close to a fire. That's crazy. And so if they can do that here, who's to say that hasn't happened on a place like Enceladus? Now, Dana also mentioned that there's evidence for hydrothermal vents on the ocean floors of Enceladus. And that's extremely exciting to us because we have hydrothermal vents all over our ocean floor, and we know that they're teeming with life. So this is, again, a microscopic life form that lives on Earth hydrothermal vents, P. furiosus, and it actually helps feed a lot of the other organisms that we know live at hydrothermal vents. So while microbial life is probably the most diverse and most rich at these vents, we know that there's crabs, there's tube worms, there's all kinds of crazy things. And the reason we're particularly excited about these hydrothermal vents is as that superheated water comes up out of these geysers or vents on the ocean floor, it breaks down a little bit of the rocky sedimentation around it. And so it deposits all of these rich minerals and hydrogen into that water. And it turns out that we know here on Earth, there's lots of organisms like P. furiosus here, that can use the hydrogen and some of the other minerals that are coming out of these vents to power themselves, right? They use it as a source of energy. And when they do that here on Earth, the byproducts of using that hydrogen and sedimentation is the living things produce methane and water. And so it's completely plausible that life has evolved to exist on those hydrothermal vents on Enceladus's ocean floor. And so it'll be really exciting to continue to explore those environments on Enceladus and see what they hold. Now, we've also been kind of trained to think that life needs sunlight and water, but not always. What if we go 2 miles below the Earth's surface, so deep into a South African gold mine? This little creature, H. mephisto, was discovered. So this is a roundworm. It is a complex multicellular organism. And again, it's living 2 miles deep into our rocky core. No light, very little water. You may be wondering, how does it survive? Turns out he's not alone. There are hundreds of different species of bacteria that have been found to thrive in that rocky core, and this guy probably eats them. And so even deep below the surface of our Earth's crust, there's life. Now, one of the other environmental constraints that we often think about when we consider space is the fact that there's a lot of radiation in space. UV radiation from suns, cosmic radiation, all of that. And radiation is really bad for life. Radiation damages our DNA. And when our DNA gets damaged, it's very hard for our cells and then for an entire organism to reproduce. And so that's a challenge for life, this intense radiation. But let me introduce you to Dinococcus radiodurans. This bacterium looks very underwhelming, but it's the superhero of the bacterial world. Dinococcus is what we call a polyextremophile, meaning think of the harshest place on Earth and it will survive there. Cold, not a problem. Acid, cool beans. But what really makes it a superhero is that radiodurans has evolved ways to shield and protect its DNA molecules from intense radiation. It's been shown to survive radiation levels 1,500 times greater than what would kill you or I. That's amazing. It actually has a place in the Guinness World Record book. It's listed as world's toughest bacterium. So that's pretty cool. But I have a soft spot. I have to admit, I have one very particular extremophile organism that I like a little bit more than radiodurans. And that's the tardigrade, because they're so cute. They're also known as water bears or moss pigs. They're very small. You wouldn't be able to see them with the naked eye. So this was, again, taken with an electron microscope. But it turns out that anywhere on Earth we have looked for the presence of tardigrades, we found them. They can live almost anywhere. And they have this really amazing ability to survive really harsh environments. And they do that by undergoing this special process that we call cryobiosis. It sounds really complicated, but what it means is they dehydrate themselves. They expel all of the water that's inside their body, and they form what's called a tons state. So if you look at my image in the lower right-hand corner there, so the tardigrade that's on the top, that's a fully hydrated, animated, doing its everyday thing tardigrade. But then you see that little ball at the bottom that looks like, a brown crumpled paper lunch bag. That's a tardigrade that went through cryobiosis. It can sit in that state for decades and then just reanimate itself one day and continue about as if nothing ever happened. Experiments have shown that these guys can survive going to negative 458 degrees Fahrenheit. So they would have no problem with the surface conditions on Titan. They would probably be pretty happy. So in 2007, the European Space Agency actually did the TARDIS experiment, which is tardigrades in space. They wanted to know what would happen to these little guys if we put them up in space. And so they sent about 3,000 tardigrades in that tons cryobio state up into lower Earth orbit. And they spent about 10 to 12 days there. So this is the Photon M3 capsule that they used for this experiment. And on sort of that circular front of the capsule there, they attached this biopan. And the tardigrades were inside this biopan. And so once the capsule was in position in lower Earth orbit, that biopan swung open and they exposed the tardigrades to space. So remember, space is very, very cold. There's no oxygen, and they're being pummeled by all of that cosmic UV radiation. They then brought our tardigrades back down to Earth, reanimated them, and a very large percentage of them actually survived that exposure. And so dinococcus, tardigrades, everything else we've looked at suggests that even though conditions on Enceladus and Titan and other planetary bodies might not be what we think of about life, absolutely life could potentially exist there because we see life even in our harshest environments. Now, as we embark on these space explorations and we search for life throughout our solar system, one question that often comes up is, what if we find it? What if we get samples of life? Would we bring it back to Earth? Could we bring it back to Earth? What would happen if we did? Could it be harmful to us or life on Earth? So that's a concept we call backward contamination, the introduction of extraterrestrial life or their biomolecules to Earth. And long story short, we don't know what would happen. Our entertainment industry is very happy to step into that void of not knowing and fill our heads with lots of imaginative scenarios. So I remember years ago enjoying reading Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain, which is about a military satellite crashes in New Mexico, happened to have this extraterrestrial microbe all over it. What happens? Even Steven Spielberg's E.T., right? E.T. stands for extraterrestrial. And things were going great in that movie when the kids were involved. And as soon as you get adults to realize, oh, an alien crashed here, things go crazy, right? And you end up with these biocontainment suits and units and right, this fear of, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And so those are important questions to ask. And we'll talk about how we kind of think about that in a second. But there's a flip side to that question that you don't really hear talked about very much publicly, but it's just as important. And that question is, what if we accidentally introduce Earth life to another planet or moon? So that's called forward contamination, the transport of Earth-based organisms and biomolecules to other celestial bodies. And there's really two reasons why we would like to avoid forward contamination. The first, kind of maybe more obvious one, is that if we're going to try and take samples from places like Enceladus, Titan, Mars to look for life, it would be a big bummer if they were filled with contamination of our life. Like, can you imagine as a scientist, like getting a Mars sample and evaluating it, be like, oh my gosh, I have DNA and proteins. And then you find out they were just from a bacterium that we have here on Earth. That would be crushing, right? So we want to try and keep that contamination to a minimum so we can actually really evaluate any samples we take from other planetary bodies. The second reason we really should be aware of forward contamination is we would like to not introduce our organisms into an extraterrestrial ecosystem because we don't know what would happen. What if our organisms outcompete that extraterrestrial life form and take over their environment? We would basically be introducing invasive Earth species throughout our solar system, right? We have that problem here on Earth. Indiana has its garlic mustard and Japanese beetles. The new one for North America in general this year, if you've seen it, is the giant murder hornet, which sounds horrifying on so many levels. But it's something we have to think about. And sadly, we haven't done fantastic job on celestial bodies that are closer to home. So you know that we've put astronauts on the moon. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the Apollo missions. Well, it turns out during those missions, astronauts left bags of human waste, a lot of them apparently, on the surface of the moon. Well, we know human waste is filled with millions and millions of bacteria. So in essence, we left bags of bacteria on the surface of the moon. Are they living? Did any of them manage to evolve to that environment and survive? What I know about bacteria that live in our intestinal system makes me think no, but you never know. Maybe when we plan to put astronauts on the moon here in the next few years, that'll be one of the experiments they look at. Did any of them survive? Even more recently, though, just last year, the Israeli Space Agency launched a lunar lander. Plan was to have it land on the moon. Didn't so much land as crash and break into a lot of pieces, which in and of itself is not a big deal, except they kind of omitted part of their payload. If you're going to put microbes onto anything that's going into space, you're supposed to declare that. It's part of our outer space treaty to try and prevent things like forward contamination. And they didn't tell everyone before launch that they had actually packed their lander filled with tardigrades. So now we have this crash lander with tardigrades on the surface of the moon, and we don't know what will happen to those tardigrades. Right. And so we have lots of instances where we've sort of already created some contamination close to home. We really need to do a better job of being aware of that and containing it as we broaden our exploration throughout our solar system. So NASA does have a plan to control that. There are scientists that think about it, which is a good thing. And so there's a whole safety mission section to NASA. And within that, there is a division called Planetary Protection. It is run by the Planetary Protection Officer, Dr. Lisa Pratt, who was formerly at IU Bloomington. And the whole goal of this division is to promote responsible space exploration. And there's a couple of different ways that they go about doing that. And so one of the ways is to help assist with the construction of sterile spacecraft, right? We want to try and limit any of our earthly microbes hitching a ride on the craft that we put into space. And so my image on the left here is some NASA engineers finishing up or working on construction of Mars rover Opportunity. And so you may notice that the engineers are wearing the equivalent of hazmat suits. That's not to protect the engineers. That's to protect the rover from them. We have millions of bacteria all over our body. And so every time we touch something like the rover, we can potentially leave behind bacterium. And so a lot of the assembly of our spacecraft involves these specialized suits to reduce us transferring bacteria. Even that whole room is considered a sterile room where they're really trying to control and reduce any possible contamination with living organisms. Another way that this Planetary Protection Group tries to control and contain forward contamination is by getting involved in the flight plans of all of the spacecraft that NASA launches. So what do I mean by that? Well, my artist rendering on the right there is actually supposed to be an image of the Cassini spacecraft at the end of its mission life. Right, so we launched it to explore Saturn and its moons, but when its mission life ended, the question becomes, what happens to that spacecraft? And so the Planetary Protection Group worked very closely with mission control, and they crafted a plan to intentionally crash Cassini onto the surface of Saturn. We sort of already had some hints that some of these moons would maybe be potential sources of life. And the last thing we wanted to do is have this spacecraft crash into one of those moons, potentially introduce any sort of Earth microbes, and risk contaminating our research field or decimating the ecosystem. And so it was intentionally decided to crash Cassini onto Saturn. Beyond that, it's a lot of policy stuff, enacting rules and regulations that I'm not going to bore you with. So if we think about what we know from life on Earth and what it looks like and where it is, it's carbon-based, and that carbon helps create big, large molecules that get organized into cells. But those cells can live almost anywhere. And so that's really exciting when we think about exploring for life in our universe. Enceladus and Titan are two really great candidates. They have these carbon-based building block molecules, they have water, they have hydrothermal vents. And so that's really, really exciting. Also, Europa and Mars are always in the conversation as having environments and biosignatures that could suggest life. And so it's really exciting to think about what could be out there in the solar system. But I think it's important to also remember everything I've told you is based on an N of 1, life on Earth. And hopefully what you got from this is life finds a way. And just because life on Earth is carbon-based and associates into cells, doesn't really mean life on other planets and moons has to be that way. It is absolutely possible. Life has found a different way to come into being and to evolve. And that's exciting. And that's one of the goals NASA has, is to ask that question. Is life different in other places? So thank you guys. I hope this was interesting.
Thanks, Jen. That was amazing. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did too. So if anyone has a question, go ahead and put it in the comments section. If you're just joining us, our guest is Dr. Jen Major from Ball State's Department of Biology, and I'm Dana Thompson, the director of the Brown Planetarium. And as we wait for questions to come through, I actually have a few. Do you think the definition of life will change or evolve anytime soon? And if it does, what might change about it?
That's a really good question. And I think our definition sort of always changes as we discover new organisms that function in ways we never thought of. We sort of refine that idea of life. I think the one thing that really challenges that question right now are viruses. The consensus among scientists is that they're not alive. And that's because they don't necessarily do those 6 properties that we talked about at the beginning independently all on their own, which is what we've historically thought life needs to do. And that's conflicting because viruses are carbon-based. They have all 4 of those major biological molecules. They create a structure that looks a lot like a cell, but we don't consider it that way. And so a lot of people argue that it can't be not alive either. And so viruses sort of really exist in this weird gray area. And as we learn more about them, maybe that will force us to redefine what we consider to be living or not.
So I have to ask, do you think that there is life or intelligent life elsewhere in our universe? So we've been able to find a lot of exoplanets, planets going around other stars. We can't really check them out up close. We haven't even really been able to go outside of our own solar system yet, let alone visit other stars and other star systems. But scientists have estimated that there's about 17 billion Earth-sized planets in our Milky Way galaxy alone, and there's billions of other galaxies out in our universe. So what do you think about the potential for life out there?
My personal opinion is I think there is life out there. You know, again, if you look to Hollywood, they're like, oh, life out there is green skin with big heads and eyes. Most scientists you ask would tell you that the first organism we'd probably discover is some sort of microbe, some sort of bacteria. And if you look at our extremophiles, that's why we sort of think that way. They've been able to fill every environmental niche we can think of. And so I think it's highly plausible there's bacteria all over the universe or something like it. In terms of intelligent life, yeah, why not, right? The trick is, I think we think very much in terms of our time. But if you think about Earth, it's 4.5 billion years old. It took about 1 billion years for the most primitive life form to evolve. And humans, modern humans, Homo sapien, has only been here for, I'll split the difference, 250,000 years. That's like a blip in terms of Earth time and geological time. And other planetary bodies have evolved or been created at different times relative to Earth. So being humble, I would like to think that intelligent life could have evolved somewhere else in our universe, but the idea that it would evolve at exactly the same time as us, that we could detect it, that's probably less likely. So could it have at some point? Sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. We're here and we're an example, but, there's lots of potential for out there. And I mentioned 17 billion Earth-sized worlds because that's what we're used to. You said we have N of one. So we're trying to look for planets that are similar to Earth in some ways. But that also means that those planets are Venus-sized too. And we know Venus has very harsh environments. It's hot enough to melt lead on planet Venus. So it has this really thick atmosphere. So that actually brings me to another question that I have about atmosphere. And so I was wondering if H. Mephisto and I'm going to get this wrong, but H. Methanicola, if they breathe and what that maybe looks like and how an organism, these extremophiles, can live without an atmosphere, because we would think that there is our atmosphere around Earth and that allows a lot of the conditions for life to thrive, but as we saw in your talk, that's maybe not the case always.
Right. So that's an interesting question. And I think when we think of breathing, we think about our requirements for breathing, that we need the oxygen that's in our atmosphere in order to do that and drive our cellular processes. But this gets to that whole, how do living things use energy? And it turns out there's a lot of ways to obtain energy without breathing. Which might change our requirements for an atmosphere. So the ice worms, for instance, because they're in ice, it turns out a lot of species of them actually live in methane ice structures. And so they're actually using the methane that's in there to drive their form of breathing and processes. They don't have these oxygen type requirements. A lot of the bacteria, especially the ones deep inside the earth, again, they don't need oxygen, they don't need water, they use hydrogen to drive a lot of their metabolism and their energy usage. And so, exactly what that might look like off Earth, I'm not sure, but based on what we see from here and how we know different organisms can obtain energy in ways that we don't think of, I think you could have things evolve in an atmosphereless environment. It's just, again, I think we have to expand our definition of what we conceive to be life and what that would look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do see the ethane and methane on Titan. As you've mentioned, it could be potentially habitable for organisms, just not something that, again, we're directly familiar with in our day-to-day lives. But if you study it like you do, you can see that. So we have a question from Brent asking if the 17 million, which if I said million, I meant billion Earth-sized planets, was based on observation or extrapolation. So we have that number, 17 billion Earth-sized planets are estimated in our Milky Way galaxy because of surveys we've done with things like the Kepler Space Telescope looking for these exoplanets. And we found and confirmed over 4,000 exoplanets in our Milky Way galaxy. And from those observations, we were able to extrapolate the 17 billion Earth-sized planets in our Milky Way galaxy. So it is based on some evidence there. So my last question, and as we wait for any other questions that maybe come through the chat here as we wrap up, but every time we talk about chemistry, I have to ask, what is your favorite element?
My favorite, oh my gosh, I don't know if I've thought about that. I guess maybe oxygen, because it's just involved in like everything I ever talk about. It's in water, which I didn't mention in the talk, but all living things are, the number one molecule you find in them is water. So human beings are estimated to be like 75% water. And so that's really important to life. And so oxygen's in everything. I think it's a pretty cool element.
Yeah. Some people would say gold, but I'm glad that you like oxygen.
There's gold in living things too. There's gold inside your body. So don't try to like extract it or anything. It's not that much, but it's there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much, Jen. It was a pleasure having you, and it was really informative.
Well, thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. If you do have a question and you're watching this later, go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll try to get that answered for you. But you can stay tuned throughout our Your Universe series, because next week we're going to be talking about the weather on Uranus and Neptune, our next two planets that we're going to be exploring with Dr. Dane Kavars. And that's Friday, July 3rd at 11 a.m. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and a wonderful weekend.